Listeners, I see Michael already smiling. He anticipates what I will say. My good friend.
And I put my head on a block, and I offer Mr. Brother Bishop the scalpel to cut it off.
The political leader has said several times up to last night that that is not a reflection of her personal views or the views of the party. And you understand, George, how elections at the party level work.
So Dr. Payne, do you have ties? Do you have ties to the National Democratic Congress, Dr. Payne? Or rather, were you commissioned by the NDC
to use that information? Because it seems interesting that a lot of your advice is very consistent with what was said. Brilliant.
Brother, good luck with everything.
You too, man. May the best candidate win in the town of St. George.
But kill on.
Yes.
You is a tongue man too, so stop at that. Tell everybody you are a tongue man too.
We are a people who have always aspired for more, who've always aspired to do better, who've always accepted that not because your mother didn't go to secondary school, you should go. It has always been the other way around. You should aspire.
You've been there for a long time. Want to be queen of St. Andrews, but yet the problems around you you're not seeing. You can't pray yourself out of the problems in St. Andrews.
Some persons were getting pension after 2 terms in office, right? And the persons that work for 26 years plus not getting anything. It's just unfair.
God is good, and God looks after me. You know, not just my wife is no longer here, so both herself and the father up there are looking after me very, very well indeed.
Not a few people that you pick up by the side of the road to run an election, to run in an election. These are not people that you mustered up and you pulled together a few months before you think an election is going to call, and you say, we want to win an election, so let's come together.
We seek the truth.
Would you be handing your resignation to the Minister of Culture tomorrow, sir?
No, I will not.
Leader of the opposition, you have accused your government, sir, of using the Grenada Development Bank to facilitate the financing of personal loans for certain government ministers.
The other side is in no position to talk about those issues, and I will leave it there.
We discover new perspectives.
You know his leadership style. And so many are saying, why are you coming now to talk about those issues?
Now is the time to speak. You have the right to decide who will take over.
And you met with Dr. Mitchell, and perhaps you might want to confirm what that meeting was about in your response. But
Dr. Mitchell, like myself, are Grenadians.
We ask the right questions.
Why was there no report on the work done of the commission? And how is this new committee different from the commission that was initially established back in 2022? So who are these elements that are using you?
I'm disappointed in my political leader.
And why is that animating those political conversations now?
This is a very interesting question.
The Bub Reports with Dr. Kellon Bub. Thought-provoking, truthful, unbiased, and truly original reporting.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Bub Report. I'm your humble host, Dr. Kellon Bub. Now, before we get into this week's editorial, I do want to take this point of personal privilege to express my sadness at the passing of my oldest grand aunt. My maternal grand aunt passed away in Barbados last week, Tuesday. Of course, her name was Olga Redhead. She's the daughter, the very first daughter of John Redhead, the late John Redhead, who was my great-grandfather from Crowshoe in St. Andrew. Of course, Olga lived a full life, and she died at the wonderful age of 93 years old. She served in St. Croix and in England as a nurse, and served as a nurse with her best friend Roz, and they both retired in Barbados together and lived out the rest of their life there. Roz, of course, is still alive. So again, I want to extend my condolences to my cousin, that's Olga's daughter, That's Lorraine, who is grieving her loss at this time. Of course, Olga, you will be sincerely missed. I loved you a lot, and I enjoyed our conversations. I also love the fact that you were an ardent viewer of the Bub Report. So may you rest in peace, and may your memory be a blessing. Now, I also want to take this time to congratulate Black Adan on a wonderful performance, a wonderful season for the 2025 Trinidad and Tobago Carnival. I had an opportunity to be in Trinidad and Tobago for Carnival, and it was such a joy, such a pleasure watching Black Adan thrive in the way that he did for the Carnival season. So congratulations again to you, sir. I understand that there will be a motorcade in Grenada in your honor, so I believe that that is well deserved for flying the Grenada flag so high in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Now let's get on with the editorial of the week. Now in January of 2025, in the January 2025 edition of the biannual Future of Jobs report, the World Economic Forum said that 41% of companies anticipate workforce reductions in the next 5 years due to artificial intelligence, citing skills obsolescence and caused by AI and other technological advancements. Now, between 2023 and 2024, the World Economic Forum surveyed over 1,000 global employers, which represent more than 14 million workers, 22 industry clusters, and 55 economies around the world. This large-scale sample size provides insights into the workforce trends and AI statistics that companies anticipate over the next 5 years. And this is coming into stark reality in the banking sector. Now, only last week, Singapore's largest bank, the Development Bank of Singapore, announced plans to slash 4,000 jobs over the next 3 years, citing AI as a primary reason. Now, according to the bank's leadership, they have deployed over 800 AI models across 350 different areas of operation, significantly reducing the need for human workers. Now, while DBS will be creating 1,000 new AI-related jobs, that still leaves a net loss of 3,000 positions, with contract and temporary workers bearing the brunt of the cuts. This development in banking is just the tip of the iceberg. A Bloomberg intelligence report warns that global banks alone could cut 200,000 jobs in the next 3 to 5 years because of artificial intelligence advancements. Now, closer to home in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, AI is already changing the landscape of work in that country, according to Basil Jarrett. He says, quote, "We just have not fully grasped it yet. More local companies are using AI chatbots instead of hiring customer service agents. Even the business of process outsourcing industry, one of Jamaica's biggest employers, is starting to feel the heat, with artificial intelligence automating call center tasks that once required human workers," unquote. Now, according to the International Labour Organization, workers who are women working in urban areas, younger, non-poor in formal sectors, especially in banking, finance, or public administration, or those who have higher education, are more exposed to automation through generative artificial intelligence. The potential loss of well-paid, formal, and skilled jobs in industries that are dominated by women due to generative AI automation would have negative impacts for the already high informal and unequal economies in the region. So where does this all lead us? There are two distinct paths, and this AI revolution or disruption could take. One is the path of automation, based on the idea that AI's role is to perform tasks as well as for better than people. Currently, this vision is what dominates. The second path is focusing on creating new tasks and capabilities for humans, rather than sidelining them. The augmentation of human capabilities by creating new tasks and providing better tools and information for workers was the bedrock of wage growth and shared prosperity during the decades that followed the Second World War. Now, in principle, artificial intelligence could magnify the possibilities for human complementary technological change. It could also enable the development of a whole array of tools that provide better information to human decision makers. Critically, this need not to be limited to office workers and professionals. Much of the workforce today, from blue-collar workers in factories to electricians, plumbers, educators, and healthcare providers, depends on problem-solving and real-time decision-making. With better context-specific information, these workers could become more productive in these tasks as they are performing and venture into new, more complex realities. Now, there is much more to be alarmed about when it comes to artificial intelligence. But if AI brings a dystopian future, it will not be because this was the only path available to us. It will be because we failed to grasp how this technology could be developed and used, and how it could help workers rather than just replacing them. Understanding this is therefore a first step toward the right type of AI revolution. Folks, this is the Bub Report. We'll be right back for the first segment of the program. Please do us a favor by liking and sharing this week's live stream. Please stand by.
Ones pass on, they deserve to be treated with dignity. And at S.A. Johnson Funeral Home, we can provide you with that service. We can take you every step of the way during your sorrowful moments. When that need arises, call S.A. Johnson Funeral Home at 347-777-9797. That's 347-777-9797. S.A. Johnson Funeral Home is a Caribbean family-owned funeral home here in Brooklyn, providing funeral services, but in a dignified way. From cremation to burial to the repatriation of your loved ones, you don't have to go through the hassle, as we provide exceptional service that allows you to mourn and heal peacefully. For more information, visit our website, www.sajohnsonfuneral.org. Send us an email at sajfuneral@aol.com or call 347-777-9797. S.A. Johnson Funeral Home, because you deserve to be treated with dignity.
And folks, welcome back to this week's edition of the Bub Report. Now, last week, Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonzalves of St. Vincent and the Grenadines ignited a firestorm after a leaked letter surfaced in the public domain that was addressed to Prime Minister Gaston Brown of Antigua and Barbuda. In the leaked letter, Gonzalves expressed his concern about the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank's decision to spend upwards of 22 million EC dollars to construct an official residence earmarked for the governor of the institution. Gonzalves urged Brown to address what he calls an absolute scandal. The Vincentian Prime Minister said in the leaked correspondence that he was only made aware of the extraordinary price tag for what he dubs a, quote, palace project, unquote, by his Minister of Finance, Camilo Gonzalves of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who incidentally is the son of Dr. Gonzalves as well. He criticized the extravagant venture, particularly given the financial hardships facing many Eastern Caribbean states at this time. In the letter, the Vincentian Prime Minister described the decision as excessive, an outrage, and irresponsible, emphasizing that the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union cannot afford such lavishness while its people struggle with rising food prices and poverty. Gonzalves then questioned why the ECCB would spend upwards of 22 million EC dollars on what he dubs a mansion of over 10,000 square feet. Now, Gonzalves, who said he was shocked to the core to learn about the sum being expended on the property, which he also described as an absolute scandal, said that there had not been sufficient transparency by the governor on this matter. He also accused the ECCB Board of Directors, of which St. Vincent and the Grenadines is a member, and the Monetary Council, of which St. Vincent and the Grenadines is also a member, of failing in their oversight duties, placing the blame squarely on the governor for what he called poor judgment and insensitivity. Now, Gonzalves' letter, however, neglected to acknowledge the collective decision-making structure that exists at the institution. The Monetary Council is made up of one minister of each participating country, including St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Then comes the Board of Directors, who are responsible for policy and the general administration, that is made up of the governor, the deputy governor, and one director from each participating country, including St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now in 2023, the ECCB Monetary Council was chaired by Gonzalves' son himself, Camilo, the current Minister of Finance in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So the question is, what role did Camilo play in all of this? And why is this issue coming to the fore now, when construction of this building did not start to happen overnight? In fact, the construction was also happening during Camilo Gonzalves' chairmanship of the Monetary Council. And here to make sense of this issue, Mr. Peter Wickham, of course, he's a political scientist, as well as Brian Samuel, who is a development consultant who spent a number of years working with the Caribbean Development Bank. And so he has intimate knowledge of the functions of the Caribbean Development Bank, not the CDB, but he does have knowledge with banking institutions of that nature. And we're now going to play that conversation that we had with them earlier today. Gentlemen, welcome to this week's edition of the Bub Report.
Good morning. Good morning, sir.
Yes.
Good morning. Good to be with you. And good morning, Brian.
Yes. So, gentlemen, I do want to begin with an overarching question. Of course, Brian, you worked with the Caribbean Development Bank at some level, of course, not at the governance level, but you have some intimate knowledge of governance in respect of what that looks like. Let us first and foremost talk about the appointments of leaders of development banks in the region, or financial institutions such as the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, which has that fiduciary oversight responsibility. Obviously, some might argue that it should be strictly based on merit and that other factors should not come into play. Do other factors come into play when we think about the appointment of presidents of banks and governors of banks in the region? Brian, I want to start with you on that question.
Well, like you said, I'm going to make sense of this. I can't make any sense of this because I'm struggling myself. Yes, of course. Yeah, I mean, CDB and ECCB and CARICOM and all these regional institutions and so on, of course, they are all run basically by either the prime ministers of each country or the ministers of finance of each country. So I find it highly disingenuous for the prime minister of St. Vincent to come around and express outrage and shock and horror about all of this. What, you haven't been listening to your son? You are on the council. His son, the Minister of Finance, is on the council. They've been doing this thing for 2 or 3 years. So there's another agenda here. Of course, what it is, who knows? But there is another agenda here, and I find it very distasteful that Timmy is being held out to dry like this.
Yeah.
You know,
go ahead, Brian. Finish your train of thought, please.
You know, the prime minister says, "I just discovered this. Oh my gosh, I'm so shocked. He must go." It's very much similar to Donald Trump 1 hour after the plane crash, blaming it on DEI hires. You have to go through a due process. The Prime Minister of St. Vincent should not be making these inflammatory public statements when he, quote, just found out about this. Make a statement, have it investigated and so on. But to call for the resignation of the governor, I think, is highly unusual and highly improper.
Peter, let us get your take on this. Brian seems to be saying here that there appears to be some abdication of responsibility on the part of Gonzalves in relation to reporting obligations of his own son, who is the finance minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who has representation on the board. Incidentally, Mr. Gonzalves, that's Gonzalves Jr., Camilo here, he was the chairman of the Monetary Council. Just last year, I believe, he was the chairman of the Monetary Council. So let us get your take on this. Is this, as Brian is articulating here, some sort of conspiracy to rid the bank of Mr. Timothy Antoine and his leadership?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to go back to the question that you originally asked, Brian, although I don't necessarily disagree with what he's been saying.
Yes.
In terms of what are the factors that impact on the selection of a president? And
yes.
You know, certainly qualifications are key. But I think that there are other factors. And I mean, we all understand, just like in the selection of a pope, you know, it's not who believes in God most. It's a question of who is better connected politically. And as much as I would like to think that these posts are above politics, the reality is that they're not. So nationality is a key factor in terms of the ECCB, because I would imagine that the heads would pay attention to the nationality of the placeholder, to the extent that you want to have a fair and equal representation of people over time. So individual countries will want to have a chance. And then there's the whole question of the age of the individual. I think that that's a factor. The age is something that they would pay attention to. And then the extent to which the individual is well connected and may have an outlook that is consistent with what the heads may have as priorities. So I do think the process is political. I don't delude myself in that regard. And I think it's not unreasonable that at that level the process would be political. Having said that, if we look at the question of the selection, and the fact that the current placeholder appears to be attacked, or appears to be being attacked in terms of his execution of his duties, I don't necessarily want to run to that conclusion, because I am fully aware of the fact also that this letter was private. The letter was leaked. I don't know whether it was leaked deliberately or otherwise. So while I do agree that Prime Minister Gonzalves is clearly up to something, I'm not sure what exactly he's up to. Brian's points are valid. You know, there's a board. This decision would have to have been approved. I don't know whether there are cost overruns, which would not have been approved. I don't know about those details. But on the face of it, yeah, it does seem a bit odd that you're raising these questions, you know, years after the fact, when a decision was taken, and you run with it. I don't know whether he would have supported a less lavish project. Indeed, I don't even know if the project is necessarily considered to be lavish. The facilities that the head of the CDB has in Barbados are not bad at all, and certainly comparable to what I've seen in St. Kitts and Nevis. Our central bank governor also has a fairly palatial residence. The Prime Minister's residence in Barbados is quite palatial. There are clear benefits to having comfortable accommodation for a person at that level. You know, they have to entertain and whatnot. And I think it's kind of befitting the job. So
why are you doing that? Let me just say.
Yes, Brian. Yes.
That I've been to the president of CDB's house, not the current president, but I've been to Warren Smith's house where he lived when I was working at CDB. It is in no way comparable to this palace. In no way. It's an ordinary house. It's a nice house. It's not a palace. It's just an ordinary, nice Barbadian house. That's it. This thing, I tell you, I'm shaking my head. I don't know what got into the board to approve such an extravagant design. The question is also, too, you have to look at the country factor, not just ECCB. If ECCB is domiciled in St. Kitts, whose responsibility is it to build the house for the governor of the ECCB? Is it the ECCB or is it St. Kitts and Nevis? I have a suspicion it might be the latter. I also have a suspicion that, you know, certain factors were at play when this contract was given out. It was nowhere near $22 million. And the questions have to be asked before anybody starts shouting off about asking for people's heads and wanting people to resign. Get the facts.
Correct. Yes, absolutely. And that is very important, getting to the facts. But Peter, here you're back again. You're not frozen anymore. But I want to pick up on what you said at the end of your statement about Prime Minister Gonzalves's intention here. Are you suggesting that perhaps there might be some sort of a sinister motive here on his part? Because I mean, it just appears as if he just found out about this. In the way that this letter was written, is you know. It's as though he just found out about this, that he has not been on the ground or not paying attention to what the business of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. And he seems to want to put all of this at the feet of one man without, again, acknowledging, as Brian just articulated, the entire governance structure here. So let us pick up on that. Is this political?
Yeah, no, I don't know. I think that's probably the best way to answer it. And I also think that it's difficult to come to conclusions clearly in a situation where he said that the letter was leaked. Well, the letter was leaked. The Prime Minister indicated that he took some ownership of the letter, but he made it clear the letter was leaked, and he hasn't really been willing to discuss those kinds of details in the public domain. But let's look at the way that the former president of the Caribbean CDB was ousted. And you recall that there was a cloak and dagger operation that was really very similar. The reality is, in this instance, the directors obviously handled the business better, where they went behind closed doors and put the guy on leave, and then before we knew it, he was fired, and we heard of legal action being taken. I've never heard why. I've heard through the grapevine why, and I've had conversations with people who appear to have been involved, but I've never really heard what the reason was. And I just think that in this instance, it's clear that the business was not handled intimately. So the question as to who leaked the letter is probably more important. I really don't know. It could very well have been leaked by someone other than Prime Minister Gonzalves himself, for reasons well known to themselves. But I just assume that, look, Prime Minister Gonzalves is the most experienced prime minister. He's the dean of prime ministers in the region. He's been in office for 2 decades plus. He is not going to make a mistake like that lightly. And I think that if there is something behind this that he's getting at, I mean, he knows all this. He knows that he was on the board. He knows that he's probably one of the longest standing persons that would have nominated individuals. He would have been a director himself many years ago, where he was finance minister. I don't think that any of these things have escaped him, and whatever it is that he's up to, I assume is well founded. And I'm anxious to hear why. The Grenada connection is interesting. In the same way that the former president of the CDB was St. Lucian, and that connection was also interesting. So I am these are very heavy, one could say tall grass, and I am not anxious to wade into waters that are above my head in this instance. Yeah.
And of course, Brian, and I will pick up on what Peter just articulated here in respect of what happened at the Caribbean Development Bank. Now, I know that is something that you paid attention to as well, with great interest, because of course that is an institution that you were associated with at some level. You're not representing them here today. But let us talk about, do you see similarities with what is happening here with what occurred at the Caribbean Development Bank? The Prime Minister of St. Lucia, again, Peter, and you do mention this nationalistic type of thing here. The Prime Minister of St. Lucia came out in support of the president when he was under fire at the time. So, Brian, I want you to pick up on that, please.
Boy, you're putting me on the spot here now.
That's what we do. That is what we do.
Well, like Peter says, and like you say, I worked there for 5 years at CDB, and I know a lot of people at CDB, and I also know Daniel Best, the current president, who I think is an excellent choice. How we get there is another matter. I think that if you're appointed by the Board of Governors, then you should be sacked or fired or suspended by the Board of Governors. I think it was disappointing the way it went from down up, not up down. On that whole issue with Dr. Leon, and I know that CDB is going to pay dearly for this because the court case is pending about that. Yes. And Dr. Leon, I don't know the ins and outs. I know, from talking to people, I know some hearsay and so on, which I'm not at liberty to say at all. But it was the whole procedure was very badly handled, I would have to say. And this is not the first time that this has happened at CDB. There have been other instances when people have been removed in a very untransparent manner. Just leave it at that.
Right. Yes, Brian, go ahead. You wanted to add something else.
Yeah, I was saying, but again, it goes back to what Peter and you were saying. Of course, in the choice of a president or governor of any institution in the region, merit is this much and politics is this much. Yeah. So clearly that there are forces at stake behind all of this, trying to get their man in, their woman in, their man out, and so on and so forth. And that's the real politic of not just Caribbean, but all of these international institutions. Countries who say it's our turn. oh, we haven't had a Jamaican for 10 years. It's time for a Jamaican, and so on and so on. And then people will be put into place, and there will be backstabbing, and there will be little plots and counterplots. And it's a shame because, you know, the institution deserves better.
Yeah. Now, let us talk about, because another part of this story, and again, we really want to localize this angle as well in the context of St. Kitts, as Brian just articulated, and the role of because of course, St. Kitts and Nevis, they are the country that hosts the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. Now, in respect of this particular project, the residence for the governor, of course, we also have to make the point that Mr. Timothy Antoine will not be in that position forever, and he will not be going back to Grenada with the mansion. So again, the way that this is framed is though, you know, it's his place. It's not. It belongs to the central bank. Yeah. So let us talk about the whole question of the local angle of this in the context of St. Kitts and Nevis. I'm not too sure if Brian, you've been hearing anything there. Peter just logged off. I'm not sure what happened there, but but there is a St. Kitts Nevis angle here, but also the whole question of procurement processes and things like that. There are allegations that this project started before COVID, and with COVID there was a pause and there was significant cost overruns and things like that. You would think that a financial institution such as the ECCB would want to practice prudent financial management. Yes.
And let me say this, I know Timmy Antoine very well. I knew him when he was here, when he was PF Finance. And he's a very humble man. He's a very Christian man. I am sure that he is squirming and hating all of this.
Yeah.
There is no way that he could be held liable or responsible for any of this. He is just the guy who's going to occupy it for a few years. Now, as for why, you have to look at the timing of this. Why all of a sudden this leaked letter comes to light? And the person who leaked it and the person who authorized the leaks are two different people who, you know, many times it's like, okay, you can leak it. As to why, well, I don't know. Maybe, as you said, Timmy's current term of office expires in 2026. Maybe the Prime Minister of St. Vincent has another candidate that he thinks could do a better job in replacing him. Maybe somebody not too far from him. These are all maybes, and it's all conjectures, and it's all hearsays. And this should not be the case. We should not be spreading, basically gossip and rumor about this. They should come out with a statement and make it clear what is happening. And without that, it's all conjecture. For example, me hearsay, as they say in Jamaica, I heard that one of the things is, who is the contractor who's building all of this? Is he a friend of the government of St. Kitts? Why are the cost overruns? Apparently, what did it start out at $7 million and then go up and up and up and up? And after COVID, it just ballooned? These are questions that have to be answered before anybody makes these inflammatory statements and calling for heads. And I find that to be very unprofessional.
Yeah. Let me bring back Peter here. Now, Peter, we have also been attempting to obtain a local angle from a journalist in St. Kitts. I understand that the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, Mr. Drew, journalists did ask him about this, but he made very few comments on the matter. Again, everyone seemed to be tight-lipped about this. But what have you been hearing in respect of what Kittitians and Nevisians are saying about this?
Well, no, I mean, I've been hearing about the political angle, and the argument is being suggested that, you know, Labour and certainly Dr. Drew as the head of Labour has an interest in this type of matter, and, you know, they've been exercising the options in that regard. I don't know anything about that other than what I've been hearing, but I would say that the suggestion that it can be a Labour operative that is benefiting and that Dr. Drew is facilitating is something that I think is quite ridiculous. Look, if the building is built in St. Kitts, somebody has to build it. The political identity of the contractor is irrelevant. I assume that the contractor is qualified to do it, and that's the basis on which they're chosen. I don't know about cost overruns. As I said, all of these are things which would have to come out in terms of internal investigations, but I think that Dr. Drew is right not to wade into it. The decision would have been taken when he wasn't even Prime Minister. And I think that it's right for him not to wade into it, or alternatively, Dr. Harris, for that matter, to wade into it.
For Prime Minister Timothy Harris, yes.
Precisely, yeah, because it's not really, to me, they're relevant. I think that, you know, we have to wait to see where this conversation goes, where the investigation goes, and if anything will come out. And certainly if we use the CDB thing as an example, you know, years later, we don't know. We know that there's a lawsuit, and I suspect that one may very well be forthcoming if the current governor is forced to resign as well. But, you know, you're saying pay it dearly. The CDB will pay whatever the lawsuit brings, and I think the people of the Caribbean will also pay that as part of our own contribution to the CDB. I think in the same way, the ECCB will probably have to shell out some money in this regard. But if the fundamental issue is that egregious, then one could argue that it is worth it. In the case of the CDB president, the suggestions that I have heard that are behind the reason that he was forced to resign, you know, I find it a bit peculiar, because largely because, you know, it's relatively common practice across the Caribbean, which is not to put too fine a point on it. But the argument is that this could be what is behind it. I find it a bit odd. Then maybe there's something that I'm missing. And I think this is the same case, I would say, with the governor of the ECCB. I mean, I met the individual once or twice, and I have every respect for him. I mean, I heard about his Christian values, which I think are largely irrelevant in this context. Because, you know, if it is that there was an overstep, if there was a breach of whatever regulations, then ultimately that is something that can exist independently, and he would have to give response. So we would need to know what happens internally, and perhaps we never will know. The reality is that these are jobs where there's a level of guardrails imposed around them that don't always allow for us to have a prime minister that believes, look, something is up, pick up the telephone and call and say, look, I really think you ought to resign over this, in the way that the minister can be dismissed. And for that reason, we may have these games being set up that will seem to facilitate a situation in which there's a grounded, you know, heavily held belief that an individual has gone in a different direction. You made a valid point, though, that the building is ECCB property. It will remain in St. Kitts in time immemorial, and it is an asset to the bank, which the bank will continue to hold as an asset. And I think that's a very important point. It's not about a personal effort. At the same time, however, decisions of an individual who is holding the post of governor are attributable to him. But I do agree that the asset will continue to be that of the banks for time immemorial.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me bring back Peter. We may have to have you log out and log back in again. Very good. We're not going to cover what you said there, but let us pick up on that, Brian. Is there anything else you wish to add to what Peter just articulated here?
Yeah. You know, when we talk about the asset, you know, being the property of CCB, and I'm sorry that Peter's not going to hear this because I said it before and he was off again.
Yes.
There's an asset, and there's an asset that is so big it becomes a liability. The president of Barbados' house is an ordinary house. It's a nice house, but president of CDB. It's a nice house, but it's not a palace. If you build a palace like this, and this is a palace, there's no doubt about it. Let's be clear, this is a palace. It's not going to look well for example, when the president has functions at his house, and he's got, you know, dignitaries and representatives and diplomats from England, America, France, Canada, and whatever. They're going to look around and say, this is not good. This is a waste of money, and it's not going to look well on the ECCB itself to have the president in this enormous mansion. Where the president of the CDB is just living in an ordinary house. I'm sure the president of CARICOM, well, I can't speak for that. But, you know, to have that kind of an opulent mansion sends the wrong signal. And it sends the signals that we're wasting money here. And that's the signal that everybody who walks away from a cocktail party at that house is going to say, wow, did you see that mansion? And that's not good. And like I said, I know Timmy reasonably well. And he is being hung out to dry in all of this, and I'm sure he didn't come up with this idea to build this mansion. That I can be sure of.
Peter, you hear what Brian is saying here? The collective decision, because again, two things can be true at once. There can be a conversation about the size of this facility, as well as a conversation about the collective decision to determine that this is what you need to house the governor's for it to be the governor's residence for the ECCB. So pick up on what Brian just articulated here. Too opulent?
No, he was spot on. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical challenges, so I have to be in and out. But when I came back, I heard what he was saying, and I agree with Brian entirely. From the looks of it, I think that the house is opulent. That type of thing doesn't work for me, and I think it turns off people. You know, I recall a conversation and I had with one of the head of one of the institutions in European Union, and the fact that, you know, when member states walk past executives of that association in first class and they go to sit in economy, it looks bad. Yeah. And I think it's the same kind of situation where you have borrowing member countries that are part of this thing. And, you know, some of them don't live that way, and they walk into this palace and they see where it is. I don't know if the St. Kitts Prime Minister has an official residence. I don't know if the Antiguan Prime Minister has official residence. The Barbados Prime Minister does.
Well, the Grenadian Prime Minister has an official residence, but he doesn't live there. So that is another issue as well.
I've seen the Grenada Prime Minister's official residence. I've actually even been in on for tea on an occasion, coffee really. But it's nothing like
in Mount
this.
Royal. Yeah, it's nothing like that. No,
and I think
Royal
that
is an older building. Yes.
Yeah, as Brian is saying, that's probably one of the things that doesn't sit well. And the reality is that if it is in St. Kitts, where the Prime Minister doesn't seem to have an official residence either, it sits uncomfortably that this is what is going on. But as Brian also said, the decision to make that residence or to establish it, and indeed, if there are cost overruns, the decision to let that escalate during COVID could not be his alone. And it is unfair to pillory the individual. But then again, I don't know that that's what's being done. I don't know whether this is a situation in which the feeling is that as person who is leader, he could have pulled back the horses and chose not to, and he didn't act efficiently in that regard. But I agree that it is opulent. CARICOM Secretary General's residence in Guyana is big, certainly by Guyanese standards. The reality is that it is not incomparable with the President of Guyana's residence, which I think is the fundamental comparison that we looked at. But when you look at that building, it is out of scale with, you know, what we would expect a governor to live in. Perhaps. Yeah, I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Gentlemen, of course, we will continue to watch the space, and of course that lawsuit against the CDB as well, and that is another thing here that we have to look at as well, and watching the space there. But quickly, I wanted to segue, and of course we will end the segment, and we have to get to the budget segment next. But we want to segue into more geopolitical news that is having a direct impact on the Caribbean region. And that has to do with the Trump administration's threats to sanction countries in the region. In respect, I see, Brian, you're holding your head balding there already. In respect of the Cuban medical program that has benefited so many islands of the Caribbean. Of course, there are the U.S. administration, the regime, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, they're saying that this is akin to human trafficking. It's interesting that Rubio is saying that, given what his ancestors did to Cuban people during the Batista regime. But that's another story. So I want you all to pick up on that. Of course, we have seen the whole bellicose rhetoric of the current regime in Washington. We have seen how they have been conducting diplomacy publicly, calling people into the White House and publicly shaming them, chastising them, using that bully pulpit and that big stick that they have. So how should the region treat with this issue? And will there be serious impacts that we should be expecting? Should the administration go ahead with this? And based on their posturing, they seem to be going ahead with things that they have promised to do. So, Brian, I want to, if you're willing to comment on this, any thoughts on how we should be treating with this issue? given how close we are to America's backyard.
Yeah. Well, I'm watching the response of Prime Minister Dickon Mitchell and the government on this one, and I hope it's going to be a strong response, because if we were to remove all, I read something that if we were to remove all the Cuban doctors from Grenada, we'd be left with one anesthetist and one cardiac specialist. And, you know, they do incredible good. I think there are like over 50 of them here working in the public service, in the hospitals and so on. So it is a huge issue for Grenada. And it's going to be a huge issue for every single island in the Caribbean. So I'm watching with great interest to see what the response will be. Will it be from individual governments? I know that the government of Grenada is preparing a response. Will it be from the CARICOM level? Because every government in the CARICOM, every country in CARICOM is affected by this, because every country has Cuban doctors. So all I can say is I'm waiting to see what's going to happen. And I'm hoping that there's a robust response from the individual countries as well as CARICOM as a group, because we can't do without the Cuban doctors. I'm not hearing you.
Yeah, so here's the thing. Yes, we can't do without Cuban doctors, but can we survive with American sanctions?
Well, they've already cut aid, US aid. Not that Grenada was getting that much compared to other countries, but they've already cut the US aid. So that's a done deal already. So what else can they do? Well, they could, you know, take away the visas. This is what they're talking about, taking the visas of the government officials, taking away my visa. You live there. So is this what they're talking about? And let's see how far this will go. I think that...
Yes, go ahead.
America, I mean, Trump has been backing down left, right, and center. He's backing down on some of the cuts that Doge is making. He's backing down on some of the tariffs. So let's see if he backs down on this one as well.
Well, you're saying let's see if he backs down on this one. His Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, of course, a Cuban American who is the families of the disaffected and badly beaten Batista adherents who fled Cuba following the 1959 Cuban Revolution, and this just appears to be sort of this continued historic revenge and payback that they seem to be enacting on Cuba. But I want to also make the point here, and I'm glad Peter is back. In 2019, Mr. Trump met with some Caribbean leaders at Mar-a-Lago. That was in 2019. The Bahamas, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, and St. Lucia. Other leaders at the time declined to attend that particular meeting. And of course, reporters who were covering that particular activity said that the leaders were in some sort of close to a kitchen waiting room or something like that, waiting to see this man. So again, Brian Peter is saying that this response should be a united CARICOM response, and it should not be a piecemeal approach each island are treating with this, because each island seems to have received an individual letter from the State Department.
And I agree with Brian entirely that it ought to be a unified response from CARICOM, and I think that we learn a lot from the Zelensky treatment, that Trump will take advantage of situations in which leaders appear to be isolated, and I think that if CARICOM speaks as a group, that certainly is better. The extent to which Trump knows or even really cares about this type of thing is something that I'm doubtful about, because Trump is transactional, and I don't see any transaction in this. I think this is a Rubio initiative. Perhaps he's doing this to try to regain relevance in terms of the fact that he has articulated a foreign policy on Ukraine that has gone all over the place now. And the questions really are about his credibility and his personal views on things, is in question. So maybe this is part of his saying, well, let me try to recapture some of that lost glory, and I'm gonna nail down this issue. I don't, however, agree that there hasn't really been a response. I listened to Gonzalves, for example, this week, and Gonzalves, to me, summed it up very well when he said, if the question is the visa of Ralph and Eloise that they will suspend in support of this initiative, and I have to lose my visa, Eloise will lose her visas. That's a small matter compared to the loss of hundreds of lives in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and across the Caribbean. that those doctors helped to save. And I can tell you, during COVID, when we had serious nursing challenges, a brigade of nurses came from Cuba. They were employed consistent with all of the health burden regulations and so on, as I understand it. And the fact is that across the region, you know, the medical staff, especially at the specialist level, have been supporting our efforts, you know, tremendously. Cuba helped St. Vincent and the Grenadines with the airport. They helped Grenada with theirs too back in the day before the revolution. And I think that Cuba has been very, very good to us. And, you know, for us to decide that in this situation we're backing down, it isn't. Look, I think in a situation where nurses are so hard to come by, and Cuba has been so willing, where medical staff has been difficult to train, and Cuba has been so willing to train. Prime Minister Drew, if I remember correctly, was trained in Cuba, and is an example of that level of cooperation. So, as Prime Minister Gonzalves said, if they're threatening to suspend the visas of Caribbean leaders who are involved, as they say, in human trafficking over this matter, and that's the price that we have to pay. You know, the fact is that the contribution that has been given by these doctors and nurses to the region and Cuba, generally speaking, is far more worthy, And I think that the initiative is hypocritical, consistent with the fact that right now Cuba and America enjoy a better relationship than they have in a long time. And the limits in terms of people sending money back to Cuba have been expanded. Access in terms of travel has been expanded. There's a direct flight from Miami to Havana. And in light of all of that, you know, you're going to double down on something like this is odd. So I haven't heard Prime Minister Motley, and I haven't heard any of the others. But I do think that the idea of a unified response would be an excellent idea under the circumstances. And like Brian, I don't support it. I don't have a lot of time for this initiative. President Trump has been a wrecking ball to global relations, generally speaking. And, you know, he's full of surprises. I think this one is a Rubio initiative.
Peter, yes, you say this is a Rubio initiative and Trump is transactional and this is Rubio doing this. But may I remind you that it was in 2019 that Donald Trump, that was even before Rubio was in his cabinet, designated Cuba as a state sponsor of, wait for it, terrorism. Right? So while it may be a Rubio initiative, and while you say Trump is transactional, the record is clear that he was the one that tightened the already tough sanctions in Cuba, and he's the one that tightened the already tough sanctions in Venezuela. So I'm just trying to understand how you can reconcile those two competing issues here.
Right, because in both instances, Trump wanted something. Trump has always enjoyed high levels of support in Florida, and I think that he felt it was necessary to nail down that support to go after Cuba in that instance. And I think the same thing with Venezuela. You know, you're trying to curry favor with a particular group, and these are things which you can do relatively easily. There's no loss to Trump in relation to investments in either of those places. So there's no financial loss. But there's vote gain, and I think that that's part of the reason why he would have done it before. As to why he would do it now, as I said, I find it a little bit, because I mean, right now he has larger fish to fry. But I understand the initiatives that he would have brought in 2017, consistent with the fact that at that point in time he was saying, look, let me see if I can try to curry favor with a Florida voter that has strong views on Cuba and had strong concerns about the fact that Obama was marching in a completely different direction. And they said, well, let's just bring this matter back to center. So I think that that's where he's going. Ultimately, whenever we're looking at Trump and his actions, it is that Trump wants something. And my thing is that in this instance, I really don't know what he could possibly want. And that's my feeling for putting it at the feet of Rubio.
Brian, any thoughts on that? What do you think he wants here outside of terrorizing the region? And in the context, that's why this is what it is. It's imperialism at its best. Yeah.
I think he wants to buy Grenada, buy the whole Caribbean, buy it up. What Trump wants is nobody can answer that question, because honestly, he, like you say, and like Peter says, he's transactional. When he does something like this, he wants to get something in return. What he can get in return from riling up the whole Caribbean, well, he just likes riling up things anyway. But I think that this is probably, as Peter says, more of an initiative from Marco Rubio, who's got an axe to grind with the whole Cuba situation. So I think it's probably coming from him, which may be to our advantage in that it would be easier for Trump to override Marco Rubio than to contradict himself.
Gentlemen, we will be watching this space. We'll be watching this space. Any final comments before we get to the second segment? Peter, start with you on the whole ECCB issue that we started off with. Yes.
Yeah, well, I think it's the maturing of an institution. ECCB issue has to be seen in the context of an institution that's relatively young, and like central banks and regional banks across the world, it is maturing. And I think that this is perhaps an incident that we will look back on as years to come as part of that maturity process. The president will be okay. I'm thoroughly convinced of that. I don't think that he's going to suffer in the process. And my hope is that the institution can repair whatever damage is being done to it. I'm taking note from the CDB incident, and I do believe that the CDB has been able to repair its image significantly, and I believe that it will continue to grow. And the same is my hope for the ECCB. So let's watch the space and let's see how it develops. And as I said, I'm sure that ultimately the current president of the bank will be the governor of the central bank will be he'll be all right. So I don't know that we need to worry too much about that.
Mr. Samuel, sir.
Yeah, well, and also let's put this into perspective. These are not badly run institutions. They are well-run regional institutions. I was at the CDB at ECCB a couple of years ago, and I saw their solar plant. They have built a solar car park. So all the car park is covered with solar panels, and they are completely self-sufficient in solar. CDB is an excellent institution. I worked there for 5 years. The current president is an excellent individual and a great choice to take the ship forward. But there are issues with both organizations in terms of governance and transparency, which it largely goes above the institution itself. It's largely, the downward-facing lack of transparency from the top, and I think that is a feature of many. It's not unique to CDB or ECCB. This is a common failure of Caribbean political community. So. But they are good institutions. Let's just say this for one, and I hope all the noise will die down and we find out the facts, and then on the facts we can move forward.
Gentlemen, thank you for appearing on the Bub Report this week. Viewers and listeners, this is the Bub Report. We will be back for the second segment of the program, where we will be dissecting and analyzing and making sense of the 2025 estimates of revenue and expenditure in relation to the Grenada budget. Please stand by for the second segment.
Should your loved ones pass on, they deserve to be treated with dignity. And at S.A. Johnson Funeral Home, we can provide you with that service. We can take you every step of the way during your sorrowful moments. When that need arises, call S.A. Johnson Funeral Home at 347-777-9797. That's 347-777-9797. S.A. Johnson Funeral Home is a Caribbean family-owned funeral home here in Brooklyn, providing funeral services, but in a dignified way. From cremation to burial to the repatriation of your loved ones, you don't have to go through the hassle, as we provide exceptional service that allows you to mourn and heal peacefully. For more information, visit our website, www.sajohnsonfuneral.org. Send us an email at sajfuneral@aol.com or call 347-777-9797. S.A. Johnson Funeral Home, because you deserve to be treated with dignity.
And folks, welcome back to this week's edition of the Bub Report. We're happy that you were able to join us for the very first segment. Of course, we have 415 viewers over on YouTube. And for those 415 of you, I'm asking a favor. Please do us a favor by liking. Just click like on your YouTube feeds as you continue to watch this week's edition of the Bub Report. And of course, thank you all for staying with us. Now, as a quick follow-up to our previous segment, we got news overnight that Prime Minister Gaston Brown, who is the current chair of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank's Monetary Council, responded to the furor over the governor's residence. Now, he said, quote, "There is no evidence that the governor himself has sought to be excessive, and I do not know, nor have I seen any case of corruption or something that will create an issue undermining the governor's integrity, unquote. He went on to say this, quote, what I will say is clearly, there are some governance failures here. And going forward, we're going to have to strengthen the reporting mechanisms at the institution, unquote. Of course, Prime Minister Gaston Brown was making those comments on his radio show. And finally, he said this, quote, at the level of the Monetary Council, I would say we were caught flat-footed by the amount of money spent, but I don't know we can escape responsibility. One can argue that we, when he says we here, he means the Monetary Council. Again, the decision to construct this facility was not a unilateral decision on the part of the governor. There is a Monetary Council in place. There is also a board in place. And this is what he says. One can argue that we should have known. Of course, those were the comments of Prime Minister Gaston Brown of Antigua and Barbuda in responding on his radio show to the correspondence that was leaked from his colleague, Prime Minister Ralph Gonzalves of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And now, folks, in the second segment of our program, we are now going to dissect, analyze, and make sense of the 2025 Grenada budget. Now, this budget was read in March of this year, 3 months later than the traditional December timeline for presenting a national budget to the legislature. And it's also happening against the backdrop of the $269.5 million EC dollars supplementary appropriations bill that was approved to service the state of Grenada for the last fiscal year in September of last year. Of course, the supplementary appropriations bill was in line with Hurricane Beryl recovery efforts for the state of Grenada. And of course, the 2025 budget is close to $2 billion EC dollars. The key priorities for the 2025 budget, according to the government of Grenada, includes the following: reconstruction and recovery in the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl, education and skills development, youth empowerment, health and wellness, physical and digital infrastructure, agriculture, food security and the marine industry, culture and the creative industry, energy transition and environmental sustainability, economic growth, job creation and social protection, citizen safety and security in the administration's let me take that again. All right, so those are the priority areas. And now what we're going to do, we're going to welcome our guests who are here to make sense of the 2025 estimates of revenue and expenditure. I call this a power panel of well-rounded, well-accomplished Grenadians. And of course, I will start with ladies first. And I want to welcome Ms. Laurel Bain. Ms. Bain, it has been a while, so welcome to the Bub Report. Ms. Laurel Bain, of course, is an economist. And then we have Mr. Christopher Diali, who served in the upper house of parliament representing the private sector. And he's also a very well-accomplished entrepreneur in Grenada. And last but by no means least, and perhaps we might be saving the best for last, Mr. Anthony Boson. Mr. Anthony Boson, who is represented the St. Patrick West constituency in Parliament, but he was also a former finance minister. And incidentally, the current finance minister in Grenada is also from the parish of St. Patrick as well. So we have another patrician representing St. Patrick's in the position of the Minister of Finance. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's edition of the Bub Report.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bob.
Yes, Mr. Boson.
It's a pleasure to be on your program once again in the company of such distinguished panelists.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Boson. And Christopher Diali. I feel honored being in your presence.
Thank you, and good morning to all, and good morning to the other panelists. Mr. Boson, Diali, nice to be in the company.
Very well. Ms. Bain, did you ever work with Mr. Boson at any level?
I worked with Mr. Boson while employed, maybe not directly. I don't think Mr. Boson is directly, but indirectly with Mr. Boson.
Okay. Very well. So it's always good to have these very important conversations on the state of the economy. But I want us to begin by speaking to, before we get into capital expenditure and all of that, implications of the primary deficit. Now, in the budget speech and also in the estimates, the finance minister articulated the primary deficits in the 2025 estimates of revenue and expenditure. Now, what does that tell us about the state's ability to finance the capital expenditure projects proposed in the budget against this primary deficit and against a backdrop of ensuring that, according to the FROC rules, that we're able to keep the debt to GDP ratio within a particular level? Ms. Bain, I want to begin with you on that question, please.
Okay, thank you. I will go ahead. Just in terms of a broad statement, I will say, first of all, that the budget for 2025, it's broad, encompassing almost of the policies and projects and the programs of the government. And generally, I will say some of the macroeconomic variables, they are on the right trend. However, there is a primary balance deficit for 2025. In terms of the deficit and the financing of the capital program, but first of all, I will say briefly that under the Fiscal Resilience Act, provision is made for the suspension of the primary balance. So there is provision for the suspension of the primary balance under certain circumstances. Now it means, therefore, that in 2025, the large capital expenditure and the revenue generated is not adequate to finance the total capital expenditure. Therefore, you have a primary balance and you have an overall balance. The issue here, I would say, yes, you have the balance, but you have to take two things into context. One, fiscal policy, and two, how the deficit is financed. Fiscal policy is not pursued on a one-year basis. Fiscal policy is pursued on a cycle. And over that cycle, you will have periods of high economic growth, which we call boom, high revenue. Things will happen that pushes the economy into a depression. In terms of the pursuit of fiscal policy, what is necessary to be prudent during the period of high growth, during your boom period, you should aim to accumulate reserves. And that reserves should be used to finance the period when there is no growth or when there is low revenue. So if we look at the primary balance now and the deficit, we have to go back maybe 2 years from now. And if we go back to, let's say, 2023 and 2024, in 2023, there was an overall surplus of approximately 386 million. In 2024, there was a surplus of over 300 million, 310. So over the years, you have been accumulating reserves. We had Hurricane Beryl. It means now you have to expend on your capital account. You have capital expenditure has to be higher than usual. You will have to make a decision. Do I postpone this capital expenditure until I could generate adequate revenue to finance it? Or do I use my reserves? In this case, the primary deficit, overall deficit, is financed by reserves. And hence, there should be no strain on the debt in 2025. You have, if you accumulate a reserve, a total of approximately 600 million in reserves over the last 2 years, which could be used to finance the deficit. And let me just say it like this. If the government is like a household, you have a storm pass, your roof gone. Your income for that year may not be able to build back the roof and renovate the house. What do? Do you wait? You use some of your reserves to finance the reconstruction. And hence, in that year, you will be in deficit. The objective should be is not to remain in deficit, but to try as quickly as possible to come out of the deficit position.
Very well. Thank you for that. Mr. Boson, let's get your articulation on that opening gambit there on the deficit.
Yes, Dr. Bob. Once again, it is a pleasure to be in your program.
Yes, sir.
I support almost everything that is being said with regards to the present fiscal situation. But let me start by giving a general observation of the 2025 budget itself. In my opinion, I will regard this budget as what we call a restorative budget, or a budget designed to bring the economy back on stream, and not so much an aggressive transformative budget. I think that's the first observation I want to make. Because before you can think of aggressively moving in the area of transformation, you have to restore what you have lost. And I think the budget is doing just that. When I look at the figure for 2025, I realize that there will be a significant decline in revenue. I think it's almost, revenue is expected to decline. I will get a figure. But at the same time, you are looking at a significant increase in current expenditure. And notwithstanding that, on the current account, the government is still able to generate a surplus. We move now to the primary balance, which is the index used primarily by international institutions in terms of measuring the fiscal health or the economic health of the country, how well you are doing. And here we see that a primary balance is a negative balance is being projected for this year, roughly about 5% of GDP. I will not cast negative aspersion on that at this point in time, because as has been said, that is being financed by the results. You're drawing down on your results. And remember, your primary balance is your revenue minus your expenditure, not including debt servicing obligations. Yeah. So in essence, it shows that the government is able to finance its development project. The overall balance, which includes debt servicing obligation, also reveals a deficit, which is normal. But I am pleased to see that there is no financing gap that where the financing is not being identified, as we have experienced several budgets in the past where you present a budget, huge financing gap, and we cannot say where the money is coming from. But
and then you have to go back for a supplementary to finance that gap. Yeah.
In this case, I mean, the budget is fully financed. So I must commend the government for that you present a budget where it is fully financed. And I think it covers well in terms of moving forward and receiving the support of the international financial community in providing for assistance to Grenada in its development trust.
Mr. Daly, let me bring you in here, sir, on that question of the deficit, and from a private sector perspective, what risks do you see here? Of course, you've just heard the two economists here articulate how they see the government being able to cushion that specific deficit risk there. But from a private sector perspective, do you see that as well there?
My views may differ a little from Anthony and Ms. Bain.
Yes.
The fact that, yes, a deficit budget is normal in a sense that happens in different types of budgets, but generally you want a surplus. Hence, the suspension of the rules, because the rules insist that you must have a primary surplus as a percentage of GDP. In this case, of course, you must suspend it to do a deficit budget. Tony and I agree on a restorative budget in that sense. However, we have not had good experiences with deficit budgets in terms, as Tony said, how we finance it. The Minister of Finance said he's going to use his deposits or his reserves to finance it, and of course go on the securities exchange market to issue treasury bills I didn't hear anybody talk about that to finance part of the deficit that's going to come. The risk I see here, Kellon, is the fact that in everything else, where this budget is heavily going to be spending on capital projects, the risk I see here is two. First of all, timing to get these things and the monies in place. The government said they have deposits that they're going to draw down on, because a lot of the capital budgets, for example, in the schools, are expected to start in April. We're in March. This budget is going to get 9 months to spend the capital monies that they want to spend, because they didn't spend it yet. So the other issue that comes up is capacity. Capacity from a human resource point of view and an equipment point of view, in order to achieve that amount of spend on the capital side for 9 months. We have not been good in that in the past and implementing. From a private sector point of view, the risk, of course, with the timings of these monies and the spending of these monies, getting it in time to spend it, and the capacity issues, it will, of course, affect economic activity and what we do. And the construction as the lead sector in this budget is expected that an indirect effects is the employment aspect, that it will get. Normally construction is not a productive sector, but it's a short-term help to make sure you have monies circulating in the economy and people are employed for 1 or 2 years or 3 years, depending on the projects that you have. So I see some risk associated with that in the terms of where and how and the time. And I think somebody spoke about the velocity of the spend, which is important. And that is something that we really have to pay attention to, in my view, in terms of the risk associated with the focus on such high capital expenditure on projects to come.
Is there anything else you wish to piggyback on there, Ms. Bain or Mr. Boson, to what Mr. Dialli just articulated?
Yeah, I could say here that Mr. Dialli has raised an important point in terms of implementation. So you have moved from the economics of the primary deficit to the issue of implementation. And for this budget and other budgets, it is necessary to work hard in order to implement the budget, because implementation, in most cases, there have been a lag. But in terms of so I agree with that. In terms of the economics of the primary balance, I have not seen a problem with the economics or the financing of the primary balance. And I must say here also from a private sector perspective and on the macro side, and Mr. Boson could interject if necessary. No, when we have a deficit budget, it is financed by results. No, a deficit budget could be financed by borrowing, extensive borrowing, or by increases in taxes. No, extensive borrowing means you are putting additional burden on the future generation for the present generation. Tax, you are the government is withdrawing funds from the money to spend. No, to the extent that you are not withdrawing funds from the money, it means that from the economy, it means that the government is injecting funds into the economy. And hence, they should have higher expenditure as incomes will be in the hands of recipients. So from a private sector perspective, and I'm just thinking, it may also be necessary for the private sector to be prepared in order to respond to any higher demands that may come about from the construction sector and other income. And given the international environment, it is necessary for both the government and the private sector to be prepared in terms of the acceleration of the budget and in the availability of resources to implement the budget.
Absolutely. Now, I want to go on to talk about, because again, yes, budgets, that there is also a theater associated with budgets. I remember one year when Mr. Michael Batiste, former leader of the opposition, he brought a bottle of dirty water. Mr. Boson, remember that? And that elicited
I remember very well.
a lot of laughter in the parliament at the time. And so, yes, budgets can be very aspirational, but I believe we have to understand those background variables that determine the extent to which how aspirational these budgets can be. Now, let us talk about the current debt to GDP ratio and what it may mean for further borrowing. Of course, you mentioned other ways in which the deficit can be financed here, but to fund the 2025 estimates of revenue and expenditure. And I want to quote from the midterm debt management strategy report. And this is what the government says in the folks in the Ministry of Finance who do this important reporting work. They said, while the medium-term outlook remains positive, significant risks persist, including external shocks, climate vulnerabilities, and global economic certainties. These factors could challenge public finances and hinder the successful implementation of strategic programs. Now, against the backdrop of this and against the backdrop of how they speak, of course, debt, they also indicated contracted slightly in 2024. So let us talk about the current management of the national debt, which I believe is supposed to be, I believe it's 60%, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Bain, I'm not sure if the FROC rules, if that has changed now, but let us talk about the current debt to the GDP ratio against the backdrop of the capital expenditure.
Yes, Chris,
Mr. Boson,
I would like to start on this one.
Yes.
The debt to GDP ratio, again, that is a critical variable that we have to look at. I recall a time when our debt to GDP ratio was way above 100%, maybe 110%. Yeah, that would say that your debt far exceeded the productive capacity of the country.
Yeah.
But over time, that has declined, and there are two ways by which your debt to GDP ratio could decline. One, you either reduce your debt, or two, you grow your GDP, or a combination of both, yeah, which I think is desirable. That if you could reduce the debt obligation and at the same time grow the economy, that will happen. And that has happened, I must say, over the period of time up to now, whereby our GDP has been one of the fastest growing in the ECCB. But at the same time, we have to be cognizant of the fact that if you have critical expenditures that must be incurred, for example, you look at your infrastructure, you look at your physical and social infrastructure, and you may not have the internal capacity to finance such development projects from inside. You have to look outward. And this is where financing institutions look critically at your primary balance. Yeah? If you have a positive primary balance, they will see that as an indicator that you are managing your economy relatively well. And they might be induced to provide you with the financing. However, if you have a situation where even on your current operation, you cannot generate a surplus, you will not get any such financing. And that is why over the years, we have seen steps taken to improve fiscal management, controlling your current expenditure. So at least you could generate current surplus, which you can use to finance your development project and use that to attract foreign funds to help finance your capital project. And therefore, yes, while it is desirable that we keep the debt to GDP ratio and bring it to the acceptable, I think, as you mentioned, 60% by 2030, there are situations that will arise that might make this unrealistic. And we should not be held hostage to these figures. It all depends on the existing situation and what you want to achieve. I will not say, okay, fine, I want to keep my debt to GDP ratio at that level and yet have my infrastructure in such a dilapidated state. Because in the long run, you want to improve such PSIP, your capital spending, so at least you can generate growth. And if you are not doing that and saying, listen, I want to keep my debt to GDP ratio low to satisfy international organizations, I think you will be in serious trouble. you have to look critically at your infrastructure needs, your development needs, and how you manage your current account balance. You have to ensure that you keep spending below your revenue and do not engage in extravagance. Do not engage in things that that may not be necessary, right? You have to look at your traveling. You have to look at other expenditures that can send or put up a red flag for the international community to say, I am not satisfied. The management of that economy, it will be difficult to give you the kind of concessionary financing to help you finance your PSIP. So,
Chris,
in essence, I'm saying, do not be hostage to that debt to GDP ratio. Because even some of the most developed countries in the world have debt to GDP ratios in excess of 100%.
Well, the United States owes China a lot.
Exactly. The United States debt to GDP, but we cannot use that because they print money, right? We can't do that, right?
Well, we can't do that. No, we can't.
But we must display fiscal discipline. That's critical. Fiscal discipline, and I think we will get the assistance that we need.
Yes, Chris.
Dr. Bob, I cannot not but support what Brother Boson have said, in that my thoughts on the debt to GDP ratio is just as he has agreed. We have a 60% target set for 2030. However, peculiar circumstances may make us move away from that. I think the current debt to GDP ratio is about 70% or a little less than that.
Yeah, about that.
And the idea here is that we had an unusual circumstance with Beryl. The FRA, the Fiscal Resilience Act, gives us an opportunity to suspend certain targets in order to get to do what we have to do. And remember, we are putting the FRA initially to put discipline on the spend, as Anthony indicated, on the politicians, and don't be excessive. And that has worked well for us from the time we implemented that, from after Ivan and all the renegotiation of the debt and all the trauma and that caused for us. But from my take, the most important part is that even though we go for debt and we take debt, is the ability to honor our repayments and do not default. Because if you default, it puts you in a worse situation in terms of attracting more debt, regardless of whether you have a surplus or not, as Tony indicated. Surplus is a good start and a good baseline that you could show the international community or the regional community that, listen, this is a country that lives up to its obligations, and even though we give them a certain extend financing through debt instruments, that at the end of the day, you are assured that you can be repaid. And hence we have the securities exchange market for treasury bills and bonds and so on, because it gives potential investors confidence that the governments will honor their debt in going forward when the time comes to repay. So I am of the opinion that if we have social programs, infrastructure upgrade for farmers and all of that, that is critical, and we have to engage in a certain amount of debt for it, why not? I think that is the way the country will develop. And as Tony indicated, if your GDP in the bottom part of the equation grows, your debt to GDP comes down. And vote is favor.
Yeah, Ms. Bain, you wish to add to anything here?
Yes, I'll add here. First of all, the target for the debt is 60% by 2035. So there is, the room in terms of going forward with the debt. The second thing I want to say is that at all times, debt should be properly managed. Because when it's, to me, from my experience, when it starts to run away, it's difficult to pull back. And we have the experiences of countries such like St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica and Grenada. When the debt reaches over 100%, the option they have is to restructure. However, if we look at Grenada's debt at the moment, the total debt is 2.8 billion, and that is 72% of GDP currently. Now, most of the debt is by the central government. Central government is 2.2 billion, and central government is about 58% of GDP. Now, so the other 14% is the rest of the public sector, and a large portion is the Petrocarib arrears. So with a central government debt of 58% of GDP and 14% rest of the public sector, giving you a debt to GDP ratio of 72%, it is presently, I would say, in a comfortable zone. But you cannot just say, stay in your comfort zone and say you are comfortable. You have to be constantly managing your debt and looking for options. You know, how do you finance your deficit? When we look at the budget now, in terms of 2025, and Diali would have mentioned there is some borrowing on the RGSM. However, the large proportion of the deficit is not financed by additional debt. And if even when we look forward over the next 2 years, we look at 2026 and 2027. In 2026, that's a projection in terms of a small overall deficit, about 85 million. And then we're supposed to be returning to surplus. I will just encourage that, you manage the expenditure, generate your revenue, so to return to surpluses as soon as possible. But at the moment, the debt at 72% of GDP is manageable, but you have to watch it. Do not let it explode.
So that is the cautionary tale here. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to, before we get into the other capital expenditure, the big ticket capital expenditure items that were articulated in the estimates, let us talk about those uncontrollable external risks that we have to confront. And when I say uncontrollable here, I'm speaking of the geopolitical environment in which we currently live. Issues concerning hurricanes. Of course, we saw what Beryl did, which caused the states to go back to Parliament to get a supplementary estimate, a supplementary appropriations last year. If let's assume, of course, that the growth is projected at 3%, how does government manage, especially given this particular deficit, if God forbid there is another major disaster bearing down on Grenada? Of course, we know that I believe is it the fiscal rules are currently suspended, I believe, owing to what occurred with Hurricane Beryl. But how sustainable can all of this be, especially given those external shocks that can affect the implementation of the budget? Chris, I want to begin with you on that question, please.
No problem. The risks associated with budgets in our area will always be some phenomenon passing through that will cause a natural disaster. So those are some of the risks associated with the numbers. The other risks that have been cited in the medium-term paper, of course, is labor shortages and how fast we could do what we do. We're projecting GDP growth of 3.7 this year and leveling off at 4% by 2027.
Yes.
The other thing is that we are a net importing country, and with that comes the aspect of inflation, importing inflation from outside. The geopolitical positioning now and so on with Trump 2.0 and all the tariff conversations, even though he has delayed these tariff implementations, we may see higher prices coming up on the North American market that may be imported by us through the stuff that we get in terms of supplies. Hence, I think the government, to mitigate some of these risks, Prime Minister Mitchell in the last few months have started making overtures to the African continent. So foreign policy is shifting instead of North-South trading to be South-South and outside of the South-South. So we have options. Of course, engaging the People's Republic of China to see how they can fill gaps if the gaps develop, as we're seeing now with the positioning of Trump 2.0. So it is important that we start making adjustments to our foreign policy that could help on the trade side and what may happen in inflation. Inflation, I think, from the medium term, it has eased to approximately 2%, but expects that it can increase and go back up. 2% sounds low, but in the actual effect at the supermarkets with food and other items and construction material, that is another thing that there has to be brought into the risk profile. Seeing that construction is going to be our lead sector. We don't produce steel, we don't produce cement, and so on. We may have aggregate, but those two key items has to be monitored. And after we had COVID, we saw what happened to those items. So these are some of the downside risks that we have to pay attention to. And of course, climate change, as you indicated, what happens We have sea level rises. I've said on another program, the Carnage is a significant area for us. I see nothing in this budget dealing under the climate resilience and the projects that is going to address the Carnage, but we have certain flooding happening already on the Carnage with high tide. And we don't, if we talk about some of the businesses that are pumping water out of the foundation, because of the porosity of the wall and the mooring of boats on it, we need to put that as a priority project. So there are these constraints and risks, Kellan, that I think we have to monitor and see how, you know, we mitigate or at least reduce some of them to a point where it doesn't throw the 2025 figures and the expectations under the capital side too far off, and we don't get the impact that the government is hoping for.
Mr. Bolson?
Yes, Dr. Baba, I agree with both Ms. Bain and Chris in terms of the risk. But I do not believe that in the budget presentation, enough attention was given to those risks. We call it an estimate of revenue and expenditure because that is what it is. It is not. It is not cast in stone. It's an estimate, and it's subject to the various assumptions that you have to make. You know, so it's not something that is clear. That's why it is an estimate of revenue and everything. It's never. It's not an exact science, but your estimation must be based on scientific principles as well. I did not hear enough said by the Minister of Finance with regards to the tariff wars taking place between the United States, its neighbors, and Europe, and how that will impact on domestic prices. What will happen if the U.S. decide to take over the Panama Canal and there's a blockage? Goods cannot flow through there. What will happen if the United States decide to follow up on its threat and say, hey, the Cuban the doctors and nurses you have working in your country, they are working for slave labor, as they call it. We want you to put an end to that. What will happen to our health sector? You know, so there are so many external variables in addition to climate change, you know, the unpredictability of weather. Getting a hurricane in July is something that was unheard of in the past, but it's happening and it could happen at any time now. So I'm saying that we need to be more conscious and be more aware and have contingency plans. In every budget, you're supposed to have a backup plan. Yeah, so in case that happens, this is what we will do and not be caught flat-footed. And to be honest, yes, I said the budget relatively good one, but those external variables or downside risks or upside risks, as we may call them, I do not believe they were factored into, because when I look at some of the projections in terms of growth for 2025, 2026, very optimistic. And I would like to know what are the assumptions made based on what we have right now. A situation where revenue intake has declined and will continue to decline in 2025. There's not much the government can do because you cannot say, hey, let us go and raise taxes. I think that would be politically suicidal to say you're increasing taxes now. But at the same time, when you look at the expenses, current expenses, man might say, hey, your revenue falling, but here your current expenditure increasing. Why are you doing that? I mean, that's a Caesar's operation. But there are reasons, because if you look at where the current spending is taking place, regularization of workers, can you say, hey, we will forego that, we will not take on that because we don't want to have a situation where we're not generating surplus, or bringing the police online with other sectors in terms of their wages. So many of the areas of recurrent spending that are unavoidable. Yeah. So we have to take all of that into consideration. Prices, revenue might continue to fall. We don't know because for certain reasons. But those expenses, those current expenditures, they are almost static. You cannot say I will forgo those or forgo this. You're doing that at the expense of your political future. So we have to take into consideration the politics in this whole thing. It's not devoid of politics. Yeah. That is my take on that. That we have to be cognizant of those risks and see how we can build up contingencies to deal with it.
Yeah. Ms. Bain, those external risks, were they understated, or should more emphasis have been placed on articulating those risks, which again, we can project growth. We projected growth last year. Of course, there still was some measure of growth in spite of what occurred in July. But again, this environment seemed to be much more volatile to me, especially externally, given all of these threats of tariffs. Mr. Boson just articulated what may happen in the Panama Canal. And again, who are our trading partners? Our trading partners, as Mr. Diali also articulated, tend to be that north-south confluence. So, Ms. Bain, what say you?
Yes, the returns and the risk are noted, some of which have been identified in the budget. In terms of incorporating the impact of the risk in the budget, we cannot say these were incorporated. And if you have to incorporate it, it means that you have to be working constantly, because you use the word volatile. So things are changing rapidly.
Correct.
So at some point in time, you have to cut off on your budget presentation and move ahead. However, what I think is, even before the budget being presented, your technical officers supposed to be working hard. What Mr. Boson described it as doing contingency plan. What if? How will we proceed if this happens? What will be the outturn if this happens? So the contingency plans, the scenarios should be constantly worked at. Diali mentioned some shifts in foreign policy, which may assist in terms of alleviating some of the risk. But this is constant work that needs to be done in this volatile environment, and the executive should be advised constantly as to what is happening, the likely impact, and you operate accordingly. Contingency planning is critical.
Contingency planning being a critical element of that. I'm sure all of you would agree with that. Now, last year, ladies and gentlemen, the government boasted, and we do have a question here from one of our viewers who is saying, what I'm interested in is most Caribbean countries dependent on the CBI to help fund their budgets. And now that we heard the U.S. president talking about a gold card, my question is, how would this promise of a gold card affect the countries in the Caribbean who depend on the CBI to help fund their budgets? Who wants to take a stab at that, Chris?
I want to say something, because I know Chris is on the Chris is chairman, or you on the CBI, the MIM?
I think he was. I don't think Chris is.
You no longer on the CBI committee.
Chris, just unmute your mic there, sir.
Mr. Duncan is the chairman now, Tony.
Mr. Duncan.
But you're not a member.
No.
Oh, I thought you were still a member.
So I suspect Mr. Duncan might be listening. Richard, if you're listening, Mr. Boson is saying something. Go ahead, sir.
I want to make a statement on this thing, because really we are placing heavy reliance on the CBI, or what they call it, investment, whatever it is right now.
Investment Migration Agency,
Investment Migration Agency. We're placing heavy reliance. You realize the financing that we are getting from that.
Yes.
I have said it before. I mean, I am not too optimistic about the future of this thing. And we see, as you rightly said, what the US is doing now, the gold card. That is an alternative to a number of potential prospective investors who may want to have a second citizenship. So that again is a major risk that we are not taking into consideration. Over-reliance on CBI funds in an environment that is so volatile, in an environment where anything could happen at any time. My question is, what is the alternative to a CBI or investment by migration agency scenario? What is the alternative? What happens if pressure is made to bear on that? Where do we turn to? And I was hoping, I thought Chris was still there. I thought he would have given me some answer on that one.
I could give you some thoughts on it, Tony, because...
Yes, Chris, go ahead on that question. Because again, Chris, before you, sorry, I don't mean to cut your train of thought, But I believe that the premise of the CBI was to give people who have Grenadian passports access to other countries, including the United States. So doesn't that undercut this premise of access to the U.S. with this quote-unquote gold card that this guy is doing? Chris, go ahead, sir. Yes, go ahead.
It does pose further risk for the program. You're right, Dr. Bob, on that aspect, with the visa element that we have attached from a business point of view to the program.
Yes.
Tony, what we're seeing, and I think the risk has been taken into account in this budget, we're moving from 500 plus million to 140, which is about a 400 million drop off that they have indicated is going to happen in the 2025 revenue scenario. As you know, funds from CBI through NTF is used for budgetary support. So that is a significant drop. The chairman, Mr. Duncan, on another program we were on, indicated that part of that is the volume in applications. They had a backlog in 2024, which they were able to ease, hence the intake. But the projection going forward doesn't seem to suggest that we have a backlog and what is happening. And then we have the Russia debacle and the sanctions imposed on countries that are dealing with Russia. Hence, the government, I think, is now moving into Africa in a more significant way, and other countries where they could attract high net worth people who are interested in CBI. I am of the view that CBI will continue to exist. The issue is the dependence on CBI, and with all the noise that the American government is making, how that is going to work for us going forward. Moving to, interestingly enough, Tony, we have a lot of applications coming in from US citizens now for CBI, which is interesting. But, as we move forward, obviously the marketing of the program to other countries, you can't tell high net worth people where to put their money. You just can't. And no matter what you do, they have the freedom to move their money because of their vote, where they believe programs exist that could give them some level of comfort and some level of protection of their assets. So I believe the program is going to continue, albeit not in the form that we saw in 2024, unless we get a surge of applications coming in from other countries. But there is program in this 2025 budget, the fall off in the revenue of 400 million. And by the way, our overall deficit is 386. If we were able to keep CBI at that kind of level, we wouldn't have a deficit. We won't have to find money to support the deficit in the way that we're going to look at it. So it is a significant aspect of what we do going forward.
Ms. Bain, any thoughts on that? Again, removing CBI from that revenue generation equation, what happens there? Is it sustainable, given all of the external pressures that are there to sort of curtail or weaken the incentive structure for people to come to the Caribbean to do that type of investment that in turn generates this type of economic activity?
Yes, the risk is there, and the risk has always been there. And as Viali said, if you look at the forecast, you have a sharp decline in 2025. And Mr. Boson had mentioned that revenue had declined in 2025, and the contributing factor was the CBI, the estimates for the CBI. So it appears that that some of this risk may have been taken into consideration in the projection of the inflows. But what I look at most, sometimes you get revenue from a source and it substitutes from your other traditional source of revenue, and your main traditional source of revenue is your tax revenue. So I look to see what was happening to your tax revenue. And tax revenue, despite the concessions granted, is still increasing. So I hope that, and the tax structure has remained stable for a while. So I hope that that stability in the tax structure and its constant examination, looking at arrests to ensure that your tax revenue grows in line with GDP should be maintained. And the CBI fund should not be a substitute to your normal source of revenue and should be seen as additional revenue. And my advice at all times is that the CBI funds, as much as possible, should be used in productive areas, improving the revenue generating capacity of the economy, When it's low, when it's not there, there is system in place where you have additional revenue being generated from the productive capacity that has been created by the use of the CBI funds.
Dr. Bob, before you move on,
Yes,
I think,
yes, Mr. Bolson, yes.
yeah,
Yes.
I think Ms. Bennett is on point here. I think it's not that the CBI is not important, and not that it may not continue, but let us not place over-reliance, on it, because it is really not something that is sustainable over time, right? Anything could happen. No one anticipated that the Americans were going to move on Cuban medical personnel abroad. And what are the implications of that?
Or
we could never tell.
a golden passport, yeah.
We have golden passport.
Yeah.
The situation in the US is so mercurial that, I mean, any day, things changes by the day, yeah? So the thing is that, let us not place over-reliance, and as Lawrence said, as Ms. Bain said, I do not agree that we should be using CBI funds to finance current government operations. No. That should be used primarily to finance government public sector investment programs and other development programs. So at least you can have sustained growth. Yeah? Because if the economy is not growing, if you're not investing and the economy is not growing, you have a serious situation in time to come. So my caution, yes, let us look at the CBI, or MI as you call it, but it should not be an area where we place over-reliance, especially to finance current operations. I'm totally against that.
Absolutely,
I think,
absolutely. Yes, Chris.
Just to add, Tony, Richard indicated that they are looking to lower the fees for locals to get involved in CBI through various projects, not necessarily the traditional ones we saw over the last few years of tourism and so on, but expand the bond, so to speak. In a credit union, we have a bond, and they could expand it to attract more people into the program. And they are looking at that, and they do have special programs, investment programs along the migration side to get people into the country to productive labor in the shortages where we have. So, for example, in construction and in agriculture, and how CBI could facilitate that in that sense. So they are looking at different initiatives under CBI so that, yes, I agree with you, the over-reliance is a certain risk, but if we could continue having it at least for the next 5 or 10 years in different formats and in different varieties that could attract different kind of people, then I think it's something we should consider going forward.
Now, let us talk about the idea of that CBI, a lot of CBI revenues go to the contingency fund. So there is a contingency fund, and of course you have the consolidated fund. And again, this is again for the interest of public education. The difference between the two and the role that the contingency fund would play in financing the capital expenditure of the 2025 budget. Ms. Bain.
First of all, the difference, the consolidated fund, based on the Public Finance Management Act, the Constitution, all government revenues must be deposited in the consolidated fund, and all expenditures must come from that consolidated fund. Mr. Boson will explain. In terms of the contingency fund, a contingency fund according to the Public Finance Management Act, and I know there have been two funds there, contingency and a rainy day fund mentioned by the government. A contingency fund, contingencies fund, based on the Constitution and the Public Finance Management Act, is a fund that you use in the case of unforeseen events. That is, Hurricane Beryl came, you didn't anticipate Hurricane Beryl, and you need to have expenditure. So therefore, you use money from the contingencies fund as defined by the Public Finance Management Act to finance such expenditure. And soon thereafter, the funds in the contingencies fund should be replenished. There are other funds established by the government, and I know what they described as the rainy day fund, established with the central bank, where a percentage of the money from the CBI, approximately 10%, is placed, and again it will be for rainy days. The the reserving of monies from the CBI, and any other funds, it is a good idea. In other words, you are saving, you are ensuring that you are not using your current resources for consumption or even capital expenditure at this point in time. You are putting away some for in case something's happening. Mr. Boson, you will have more practical experience in it.
I agree with you. I agree with you on that. Maybe, I don't know if you or Chris could update me on that. I believe that the contingency fund, the amount that was supposed to be allocated, that hasn't changed in recent time?
It was set at 10% from NTF, but it hasn't been happening in the previous years in the last administration at that rate. And I think now the current government has pledged, I think it's 4%, Laura could come here, but I think it's around 4% now of NTF funds must go to contingency fund in the ECCB.
10%. 10% at this.
10%, but it hasn't been,
so,
yeah.
Right. So we're using the term, and we're using the term contingencies fund to refer to the fund at the ECCB, and that one is 10% of the NTF funds.
Right. Good.
So it's reserved.
What was it before?
It was supposed to be 40%.
40%.
Yes.
Yeah, the rationale for removing it from 40 to 10. Can you tell me what was the rationale behind that?
What?
We don't know.
I mean, I guess there was a reason why it was 40.
Yeah,
because you want to have a substantial fund.
Was pretty high because when it was 40, we didn't deposit any money at all into the contingency fund. And I suppose the governments at the time decided that money from the NTF would be more productively used in other areas as infrastructure development or social programs. It is seeming to be more affordable at 10% for this current administration and the IMA, so that they could be making consistent deposits to the contingency fund.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. But
yes, Ms. Bain.
Just to clarify, so that is like an investment, that 10% of that CBI funds. And that is different from the normal contingencies fund as outlined in the Public Finance Management Act and the Constitution. We're supposed to have funds for unforeseen, unknown, unplanned events. Not so, Mr. Boson?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, very important clarification there, again, for my own education as well. I'm not an economist. Yes, I do quantitative research, but I'm not an economist. So I certainly thank you for that there. Now, let us go on to talk about, and we have two final questions before we close the program. The overall capital expenditure picture for 2025 in respect of the government's priorities. Let us get, Chris, I will start with you on that question. How much of government's priorities are meant to stimulate a private sector economic growth and activity?
Well, as Doyle indicated earlier, there has been no adjustment on the fiscal side in terms of taxes on the private sector, which is a good thing for us. It has remained stable. Of course, we'd have loved to see some reductions. There are issues for us in manufacturing with taxing of packaging equipment at a certain CET rate that we have asked that should be removed or lowered significantly, and we have had no traction on that. I think that started with the last administration, and that is something we are going to press for that we'd have really liked to see come out in this budget from a private sector point of view. But to answer your question more directly, Kelon, if the capital budget happens as it is projected and is budgeted as we see, and if what Laurel has indicated that private sector need to prepare themselves in terms of resources, through materials and other things to support the capital side, I think it is a positive thing from that sense, because our revenues can go, our economic activity can increase, and so on. And so it is important that the capital side of the budget is achieved as it ought to. From a private sector point of view, there is more revenues for us from the government. If the government decides to buy from us, because sometimes projects happen with international support, and they give concessions for everything, something I've argued for years in the Senate, that if we have productive capacity here on a manufacturing side for some things, why not use the local ones? So those are things that we have to look at. In 2024, there was disappointment with the stadium project that has not come off. And there were other infrastructural works, access road to farmers and their farms that did not materialize as they ought to. And there were various reasons put forward. Road infrastructure is a big one, and what happens there, and all the delays that happen there. We have the one with the cliff into Woodlands that is significantly delayed, and we have a big allocation in this budget for it. And of course, the schools, the building of new schools, the renovating of schools, which is, according to the minister, starts in April. And when MIT presents and the minister presents, we'll get a better understanding of what is going to happen there. But I believe the private sector is going to be cautious, just to tell answer Laurel, in how we resource. Because here it is, if you were to bring in, for example, $1 million worth of lumber, which we have to pay for, by the way, when it lands or upfront. That is how the lumber situation operates. We wouldn't want to take the chance in terms of our cash flow and expend all that money without some assurance that these projects will have started and government will look to buy from us. And that is something that we need to manage as we go forward. The concern, of course, with steel is that with Mr. Trump's positioning and how he's doing these tariffs, the cost of steel could significantly increase as it did in COVID. Again, something we have to manage and see how we tinker. And I will say this final thing, Kelon. You know, when governments present a budget, as Tony says, your best estimate, understanding the risks associated with it. But what we don't ever see happening in the foreground, and I don't know if it happens in the background, is after the first quarter, the second quarter, we look to see how our revenues are going. I know we do a 6 months understanding of revenues and expenditure, but how do we adjust the budget apart from coming to Parliament for more supplementary appropriations? How do we adjust the budget from two sides, drop off in revenue or expenditure, and how we control that so that we could tinker with the budget and areas where we could adjust. That to me doesn't happen as it happens in a private sector environment. So this is something we need to look at and see if things are not happening as we expect and there's a budget downfall, whether it's in revenues or uptick in expenditure, how do we adjust those figures to get back on track or to put us back in a place where we could get a growth that we want and get all the benefits that we're expecting to get through additional employment and all of that and money circulation in the economy.
But Chris, isn't that what the mid-year midterm report does?
No, the midterm report looks at it 3 years out.
So, it's a 3. Okay, so it's not an annual
2025
report,
to 2027, 28. Where it looks. And we short again. I said the first quarter is finished.
Yes.
And the first quarter to me didn't have major capital spend. It was more about recurrent. So the issue going forward is 9 months. And if we could afford not slow down, but as Laurel indicated, acceleration. But this is what we need to get.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, such an important conversation. Again, Mr. Boson, on the question of the capital side and government's priorities for 2025. Any broad observations?
Yes.
Against the backdrop of the scaffold of the budget that we were speaking to.
Yes.
Of course. Yes.
The centerpiece of this government's operation is transformation. Yeah.
Yes.
They need to transform, and so far, I must say, some efforts have been made. But in my view, if you seriously want to transform the Grenada economy as it is right now, there are 3 key pillars that you must give serious attention to. 1, your human capital development, or whether education and training. 2, infrastructural development, both physical, digital, social, and otherwise. And thirdly, the health. Yeah? Looking at the budget, I haven't seen anything where these 3 areas stand out as requiring exceptional and additional resources. Let us look at our infrastructure. Let us look at our physical infrastructure. Look at the Tower of St. George's. If that cruise ship terminal and the mall, that area was not reclaimed, can you imagine what congestion in St. George would be? I think we have to be visionary. Yeah, I think it is long overdue that serious attention be given to expanding that area all the way up to the point past the stadium. Yeah, we need to reclaim that area and expand that part. Look at the coronage; it's almost falling apart. You have some old, ugly-looking vessels in there disposing all kind of garbage in the water. Time for this thing to get out of there, but you can only facilitate it by creating an alternative space, right? So infrastructure, look at our roads. We still need a lot of work to be done. Look at the Western Main Road, yeah? So I'm saying once you invest in your infrastructure, that will have added effect. It will have a multiplier effect because your PSIP will drive your development. The private sector will realize, well, hey, the environment is good, let me come on board. Let us look at your education. And I might say something that is very controversial. If I had my way, Dr. Bob, half of the secondary schools in Grenada right now, I will convert them into technical, to skills training centers. We have NULO. We need a NULO in every parish because we have a serious skills deficit in Grenada. You look at the tourism sector, you're expanding hotels. Look at the number of work permits being issued. All of the high-level people have been brought into the country. You look at your public sector investment program. You cannot implement a program of $400 million a year. Why? You do not have the skills. Yeah, you do not have the manpower skills. So you always have an implementation deficit when it comes to your public sector investment program. So you put in figures there, but figures mean nothing if you do not have the implementation capacity. Yeah, and that is a serious problem. And the third area I must say is about health, because health is wealth. I have no problem with the government's decision to build a teaching hospital. Maybe it is visionary, because let's remember, when Eric Gary decided, hey, we want a medical school in Grenada, he was criticized. Most people say, hey, you want to bring in caravans in the country. But look now at St. George's University, what it is generating about 25% of our GDP. Yeah? So let us look at it and not condemn that initiative. Look at what is happening now to our nurses, or the nursing program with the Cubans. If they are to leave, we're in serious problem. So I'm saying that let us focus on our human capital development. Too many of our children live in school as functional illiterates. Every year, TAMCC puts out about 700 graduates or 1,000 graduates. What most of them graduating? Associate degree in business management. Whose business you want to manage? Yeah? Well, skill sets. Many of them out there, they can't find job, and yet we're saying we have no job. There are jobs, but we do not have the skill sets, people with the skill sets to satisfy those jobs. And that is an area, serious area that we have to look at. And I want government to put this thing on the front burner. TAMCC, in my opinion, should be converted into a STEM institution, where you focus more on the science, technology, engineering, and the mathematics, yeah? Instead of this associate degree and all this thing. What is happening in our private secondary schools? You're teaching children to be certificated, graduated 14 and 15 subjects, and yes, that's good.
And that is a flex, right?
That's
yes.
good. So let us have those skills trainings in order to boost our economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned this point. Of course, we have to make the point that the current administration is also articulating a move into technical skills and having, I believe, technical skill centers of excellence, I believe is what they call it. I'm subject to correction, but I believe that's the overall concept. But I also want us to talk about, and this will require, ladies and gentlemen, an entire separate conversation, because the World Bank issued a damning report on the current state of education in the country. In fact, not only that, I believe, Mr. Dialli, you articulated this on another program, the culture of work among young people, right? And the skill sets. In fact, there is your successor senator in the Senate. He's saying that they can't find people with the necessary skills in Grenada to get certain jobs done, so much so that they have to be imported from or brought in from other islands and perhaps further afield. So, you have really ignited that passion in me there for this as well. But Miss Bain, and then I'll go to you, Mr. Dialli. Ms. Bain, you want to add anything to what Mr. Boson just articulated here?
Not much, but to say that, based on what Mr. Boson said, it appears that there is much work to be done. And all would not be able to be incorporated in this year's budget. So what we need to do, and my understanding is that this first 3-year medium-term strategy or action plan should be coming to an end in 2025. So we have to look at the next 3 years or 5 years and say, what could we do each year to bring us to where we want to be? Taking into consideration, our capacity and assess what has been done. This is where we are. This is where we want to be, and what we need to do annually to take us to that position. But I'm aware that a lot has to be done, but we have to do it based on assessment of situation, or resource availability, capacity availability, and over a period of time.
Absolutely.
So let me just add, Dr. Bob, on this, because I'm passionate about this. I have articulated in the Senate over many years that Grenada needs another 25,000 people to make it economically viable for particular businesses. We just don't have volume in terms of people. And the economic activity of our country has been at a certain level for the last 20 years because we export a lot of our people. That's the most consistent export we have in Grenada, our people. When we graduate, as Mr. Boson said, all these young people, they don't stay here. A fraction stays here and move out. The nurses is a good example as for one of that. What I have said, and my Prime Minister have said in a different forum recently, left up to him, we scrap the work permit program. Scrap it. Even with free movement of people under CARICOM, we don't even have it yet. And let us see how we could bring in people in a structured way. And in agreeing with Laurel, we don't have to do 20,000 in 1 year. Take it in stages because we have to prepare for these people when they come in housing and other things and socialization. But at least if we could bring in 5,000 or 7,000 people a year structurally from Venezuela or Trinidad, wherever we want to bring them in, to deal with the skills gap that Tony have so correctly identified and you have indicated from the World Bank report, then we need to get it done. I mean, if a doctor, there's so much potential, and Prime Minister mentioned it, the marine sector, that needs skills that we always have to import people to do, fine carpentry, bottom work of the boats, engine repairs, and all of that we could develop among our people, bring in people, teach them, put them on programs. But we need to get people into our country. That's what tourism does for us, Kellam. It surges the population for a particular time. If it's they're coming in via the airport stay over for a week or two, the stay over arrivals will surge the economy. Same with the boats. When the boats come in on the cruise ship, based on the size of the boats, and if they spend what they're supposed to spend, the population rises in a few hours and the spend increases in that time. We need to have that on a more consistent basis going forward for us to make sense economically in the various sectors. You can't get food security in agriculture and we can't find people to work. And if you look at what's happening in our country to our men, I would say 75% to 80% of our men are on the blocks, linemen. And they're not working productively, and their attitude to work in those sectors are deplorable. Construction and agriculture is a classic example. However, our women are getting in and taking it over, and kudos to the ladies. So we need to adjust what we do. And as Tony said, if we are to make transformation, it has to be in these things and in the minds of our people to understand where our economy needs to get the weaknesses we have and how over time we need to resolve them.
Absolutely. And again, we will be having a conversation. We do have a young lady, I believe, at the, I believe it's the accreditation board, or I might be getting that's a Dr. Edwards, who we want to bring on here with a bunch of other people to speak about this labor question, because it's a vexing question in the context of Grenada. But gentlemen and lady, this again, we out of time, but Mr. Bolson, before you go, and I know Ms. Bain worked at the ECCB, so I'm not too sure how much she might be at liberty to speak to what I'm about to ask, and that has to do with the question of the, I call it a storm in a teacup conspiracy against Grenada's Timothy Antoine, the esteemed Timothy Antoine, orchestrated by some who, some are saying that is the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and Grenadines who orchestrated the leak. Again, we don't know that, but the point is that letter was leaked, and it is legitimate because the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda responded to that letter. So, Mr. Bolson, I want to get your comments on this, because you're someone who actually sat on the Monetary Council.
Yes, Dr. Bob, and I must indeed say that I was sickened to the core when I read that letter, the so-called letter which Dr. Gonzalves sent to the chairman, or the chairman of the Monetary Council, making accusations without any evidence. And what is even worse, Dr. Bob, we have locals, we have Grenadians echoing,
who are calling for his head.
I'm calling for this, Dr. Bob. This is disgusting. I mean, I do not swear for anyone, but I can tell you about Timothy Antoine. When Timothy entered the Ministry of Finance, I was at that time head of the planning department in the Ministry of Finance, and Timmy was a planning officer. In no time, in short time, Timmy moved up to occupy the position of permanent secretary when I was the Minister of Finance then. And I could tell you, Timmy, Timmy is an exemplary person, and it's so sad to see our own Grenadians trying to sully the name without evidence. I sat on the Monetary Council for 7 years, and Timmy was, for part of that time, the director on the council. And given the governance structure of the ECCB, it is absolutely impossible for one man to take a decision to do what Timmy has been accused of doing. It is absolutely impossible, because you have the governor, you have the board of directors, which comprise the permanent secretaries of the various ministries, and then you have the council of the ministers. Yeah, and during my time there, I can't recall any major decision, I mean, something like that, being done without the board approving it, and finally the council. So I could only attribute what was done as mischief, and maybe somebody else in their mind to take over Timmy's job. But it's unfortunate it has to be done that way. But I'm glad that the chairman of the Monetary Council responded, absolving Timmy from any kind of unethical practice in this month. The project was supposed to be much smaller than that. I think it's about 7 million, but cost overrun, it went to what it is. So it is not that they are building now a so-called palace for $22 million. That is what cost overrun has resulted in. And it is not Timmy's building. He's just the governor.
And that's the point I'm making. He can't take it back to Grenada with him.
He's not in this country. So why are we accused? I mean, why are Grenadians getting on board with Gonzalves to accuse the gentleman? It is unfortunate, Dr. Bob, and I'm sick to the core, because I know the gentleman. I know Timmy. You know, it just.
I also know Mr. Timothy Antoine personally, having worked with him. In fact, I've never said this publicly, but Mr. Antoine, he offered me an opportunity to work in the Ministry of Finance as his public relations officer. That was in the mid-2000s. That's just before I went off to pursue my studies in international journalism. And I have nothing but respect for Mr. Antoine and his family. They are a quintessential Grenadian family, and they represent Grenada very well. Mr. Dialli, any thoughts? Ms. Bain, any thoughts? I know you also
I will leave the last word for Laurel, because I know
Yes.
Laurel's association and ECCB and all that.
No, Mr. Dialli, I'm leaving the words between yourself and Mr. Boson. So
I suspect Ms.
do
Bain
the
was
last
going to
word.
say that. I suspect Ms.
Okay,
Bain was
go
going
ahead,
to say
Laurel.
that she's not going to go there.
I will accede to your request. Absolutely.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes.
You want
No,
me to
she
get
does.
the last
She-
word?
yes, get the last word. Get the last
Well,
word.
I will be much shorter than Tony. I think all of that is a lot of stupidness. I didn't want to say the other word because I know the gentleman well. And when you, as Tony said, when you look at the governance structure in the ECCB, I think it does not support one manism or one dictator deciding, especially on projects of that size. And when you look at when this project would have started, I think it conceptualized before COVID and what would have happened and how the RFPs went out and so on. There is no sense that there is malfeasance or some unethical process that took place. And with COVID and the increase in cost in materials, I expect there'll be cost overruns from the original budget. So, and then when we look at the footprint of the building, I don't know if it's a palace, as have been indicated by other quarters. I don't think so. When I spoke to engineers, it is not a palace, and as Boson said, it's not Timmy's building. It is the ECCB's building. So this nonsense that we're getting on with in the region, started by Prime Minister Gonzalves, is so disappointing that it ain't funny, and some of us jumping on that stupid bandwagon to,
especially and with respect to Mr. Clouden, Mr. Anselm Clouden, with respect to you, sir, as a Grenadian who was served in the criminal justice bar, law of the sea, and matters of that nature, for you to be calling for his resignation, sir, I have a lot of words, but I'm going to reserve comments, and because they're not going to be pleasant.
Just can't you have to dismiss somebody or resign for cause. What is the cause?
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a very important discussion. Ms. Bain, I would start with you for closing comments. Of course, we have the budget debate coming up next week. Of course, we also have, for the second time in Grenadian history, a female leader of the opposition, and that is in the person of the Honorable Emmeline Pear. Incidentally, both Ms. Pear and Ms. Strawn, Winifred Strawn, was the first female leader of the opposition, comes from rural Grenada, St. Andrew, both St. Andrew constituencies. So St. Andrew has that historic distinction. So Ms. Bain, over to you for some closing comments.
Just in closing, the budget has been presented. You know, as I said earlier, the macroeconomic trends seems favorable, except that we have the deficit, which is financed by reserves. There is no extensive borrowing. So what we have to focus is now on is implementation, how that budget could be implemented. Taking into consideration, there are numerous risks ahead, and therefore planning for this risk is important. For the private sector, Mr. Dialli, I suggest that the government is required to have the basic environment for the private sector to operate effectively, and this should be the focus, and it should follow the implementation of the budget, and the private sector be prepared in case resources are required for the implementation of the budget. The budget starts, the Public Finance Management Act, the Constitution, makes provision for the constant monitoring of the implementation of the budget, and it is a responsibility of every one of us and the citizens to monitor the implementation of the budget to ensure things are going as planned.
Very well. Mr. Dialli, sir.
Yeah, well, my takeaways is that, the Minister of Finance presented a budget in harmony with his theme. I have no issues with the construction sector being the lead sector, followed by tourism. I think the education sector is significant, and services in terms of SU and how we do and what we do with our young people in the education services, and a total revamping that is probably necessary, as indicated by the World Bank report. So there are things that we need to do. The medium-term strategy paper indicates the risks that we need to look at and pay attention. As Varel indicated, if we monitor and we do what we have to do, then we should achieve. However, I believe the major constraint is trying to achieve all of that in 9 months and getting the monies in time to have the accelerated implementation that we want to have, understanding our history with poor implementation rates. So we can't be at 50 and 60% to get this done. We have to be at the high 80s and so on to get this done. And if we need to bring in people and we need to bring in equipment, let us do it. Let us not wait because we don't have time to achieve this budget as indicated.
Absolutely. Mr. Bolson, sir.
Yes, Dr. Bob, once again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be on your esteemed program.
Yes, sir.
Well looked at. The budget. If I have to grade this budget on a scale of 1 to 10, I will give it an 8 out of 10. Yeah, some people might not agree with me, but under the circumstances, I will say 8 out of 10. Most people, when they hear budget, the first thing they want to know, are there any taxes? Will I be taxed or no? This budget has no new taxes, right? If there's an increase, it is in level with the development, but not to say that you have added new taxes, yeah? 2, I stay in this budget, or I look at it as a restorative budget, a recovery budget. We have just emerging out of a major hurricane, not so much for Grenada, but let's look at what happened in Carnival. And I must indeed say that having to present a budget in the wake of such a disaster is not an easy undertaking. It brings me back to 2004 when we had to prepare a budget with the passage of Ivory. Yeah, I am glad to see that the government did not have to go outside and ask for additional resources to fund. The budget was funded from internal sources and from borrowings. I'm not saying internal, from government and from the region. So that to me is a good mark. And even more importantly, that notwithstanding the drop in revenue and the increase in current expenditure, the government was able to realize a current account surplus. Very important, yeah? Because this tells you that you have some resources that you can use to finance your capital project. And indeed, that has been applied. And once it is applied, then quite obviously, we end up with a primary balance of about 5% negative of GDP. That is okay. That is okay. The overall balance, negative, but it is financed. That to me is good. My only concern is that I would like to see more, when I would say more, I would like to see contingency plans, because we are living in an environment that is very shifty, very fragile, very uncertain. And in any event, we need to have contingency plans, or what's called a backup plan. In the event of this, I don't know if it is done, but I would like to know that there are contingency plans in the event that there are slippages based on the uncertainties and the external risk to support the government going forward. And in moving forward, as I said, we have to look more strategic, transformational, in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of our education and training, and our health. These are 3 critical areas that will establish the platform for moving forward. And I think if the government was to stick to the medium-term plan and the long-term plan up to 2035 plan, I think they will be in good standing. So once again, congratulations to the government on the presentation of its budget. And let's hope the implementation will be smooth. And most importantly in implementation, the PSIP. We have a serious deficit, implementation deficit, which must be confronted. Whether by bringing in technical people in the short term, that would be a solution, but we must establish the foundation to train our people to take on the critical jobs that are coming on stream. Thank you very much, Dr. Paul.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been such an illuminating program. Again, my joy on Sundays is to assemble distinguished Grenadians to educate the national community on the issues that affect and matter to the national community. So again, all of you panelists here, very well patriotic Grenadians who have given yeoman service to your country. And I thank you so much for doing that and for continuing the business of public education. Even though, Mr. Boson, you're no longer in the public domain as a politician, I believe you are a public servant for life. All of you, ladies and gentlemen, are public servants for life. So thank you so much for appearing on the Bub Report this week.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. All right, viewers and listeners, this has been yet another installment of the Bub Report. Next week, of course, will be the anniversary of March 13th, 1979, but it will also be the anniversary of the Sky Red Grenada Revolution that was led by Grenada's father of independence, Sir Eric Matthew Gary. So we hope to actually synergize people from both movements to have a conversation about the extent to which revolutionary fervor, how much revolutionary fervor has impacted and influenced Grenada's development trajectory, and the lessons we can learn from those two very important and transformative periods in Grenadian history. And we have some other programming down the pike that we'll be speaking to. I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag as yet, but next week we promise to have yet another high-quality program from the Bub Report. So on behalf of our hardworking producers, I am your humble host, Dr. Kellen Bub, wishing everyone a pleasant week ahead. Take care now. Bye-bye. Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out the Bub Report's social media pages. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch our weekly live show, follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can catch repeat episodes on Wednesdays at 4 and 5 p.m. respectively on CRFM Radio and GBN TV in Grenada. We are also viewed on Sundays at 8 p.m. on WPG 10 throughout the Caribbean. Thanks for watching.